Hi, LudoNarraCon. I'm Jared, and I am so excited to be hosting this panel, History Repeats Stories from the Past. Today, we're going to talk about games that take place in historical settings. And before we continue, I'd like to acknowledge that I make my home and I'm doing this panel from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations in Vancouver. Without further ado, I'll let our panelists introduce themselves, starting with Shella.
Hi there, my name is Shella Ramanan. I am a narrative designer and writer. I'm one half of Threefold Games, who you may or may not know from the game Before I Forget, which was a narrative exploration game about a woman with dementia. I'm also co-founder of Pock in Play, which is an organization that we founded to improve the visibility and representation of people of color, both in games and in the games industry itself. And today I'm going to be talking about Windrush Tales, which is a game that's in pre-production. So I'm sorry if I'm coy at some points about some things. But yeah, that is an illustrated branching narrative about the immigration of people from the Caribbean to the UK in a certain point of British history.
Hi, my name's Daisy Fernandez. I'm a designer and writer at Nouriel, alongside with Francois and Jared. I've just finished working on Card Shark, which is what I'm going to be talking about today.
Hi, my name is Florent Morin. I'm the head of a tiny video game studio based in Paris, France, and called The Pixel Hunt. And we've been co-producing a game called Inwa, A Story in Ice and Time, that takes place in three different moments in time in northern Canada. So yeah, history is involved, of course.
Hi, so I'm Francois Alliot. I'm a game writer and a game designer and game developer. And I worked on Rings mostly. And I'm here to talk with Daisy about Card Shark.
And finally, I'm Jared, the community manager at Nouriel. Like Daisy and Francois mentioned, I am helping release Card Shark very, very soon. And I'm really excited to be hosting this panel. This is the first time that I'm hosting a panel in the games industry, and I couldn't be more honored to be with these lovely people, as well as all the people who are involved with LudoNarraCon. It's truly a really big honor. Thank you. So, today, like I said, we're going to be talking about games that take place in historical settings. And firstly, we wanted to get started with a little bit of a discussion about what makes a game in a historical setting different from other forms of fiction. There are novels, there's short stories, there's film, TV series, all sorts of things that take place in historical settings. But what makes it different when it's a video game, something that's interactive?
Yeah, I suppose the obvious answer is, you get sort of beautifully realized games like Assassin's Creed or something. You can like walk through ancient streets of somewhere that you think you were familiar with, and the amount of research they put into games like that makes it feel like you've actually been there. You can sort of time travel. And even if something isn't quite as sort of fully cinematically realized like those games, you can still get this because you're moving through a three-dimensional space and you have agency as a player. It just transports you in a different way to any other kind of fiction.
Yeah, essentially to me, this feels like a sort of question about immersion. And I think that video games have so many tools at their disposal to immerse a player compared to a reader or a viewer. If you can achieve that in a historic setting, you're really just plunging someone into a period of history that they might be totally unfamiliar with. And it's just a really powerful storytelling medium.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. And there's a saying that says that history is written by the winners. And when you make a game about history, you're a player, but not necessarily a winner. So I think what's cool about making a game about history is the what ifs. What if they did this instead of that? What if they tried this instead of that? And then you can allow players to explore a whole realm of possibilities within an actually accurate historical setting. And I think that that's really interesting because it's involving for players to actually understand what the historical moment was about. So I think it's a great potential.
Mm-hmm. That reminds me what you're saying, Florent, about a game that you didn't mention you worked on. But I was just replaying last night to get the vibes in. Bury Me in My Love, I guess now is a historical game in its own right. That agency, like Shella and Daisy are talking about, to immerse yourself in a specific time, to make decisions and see the outcomes of those decisions. It's something really special. And yeah, we're going to talk about some of the challenges that come with making something that's based in real life, like history. Firstly, what is your game and what historical period does it take place in? Yeah, Francois, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. So, Card Shark is a game about cheating at cards. So it's like literally you get a deck of cards like this, and you learn tricks to cheat with cards. And when we were looking at setting for this game, we thought about the classic. You could use Las Vegas or stuff like that, like make like a movie like Ocean's 11 a little bit, or you could actually try to get back to the roots of gambling and get to the 18th century. So we put the game in the 18th century during the Enlightenment of France and the preparation to the revolution, which was in France a very interesting time, because it was the crumbling of the old monarchy, and it started really like 60 years, more than that, before the actual revolution. And our game is not about the revolution itself; it's about these 50 years before, where things started to crumble, and it was possible for our con artists to get to the king table because of this sort of complete the monarchy was completely losing its substance, if you want. So that was a good time to set our game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also can think of the Barry Lyndon inspiration, which I know was a big inspiration for Nikolai, our lead artist, who originally came up with the idea of a card cheating game. Shella, would you like to talk about that? Why did you pick this specific period in time, and how does that relate to you and your story?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, it's a very specific point in British history. The immigration of people from the Caribbean over this, sort of 20 plus years. So we're not spanning that entire period. So we're picking a period, I think it will be either the 50s or late 50s or early 60s. We haven't quite landed yet. But I picked it for personal reasons. I'm Caribbean heritage. My father was from Grenada, which is a small island in the sort of bottom of the Caribbean near Trinidad, sort of level with Venezuela, if you want to sort of find yourself on a map. He was part of that generation. He came to Britain in the 50s. It was after the war. Britain was pretty much on its knees and needed to rebuild, and it had a labor shortage, and the Caribbean had an employment crisis, and there had been sort of like crop failures, and so Britain reached out across the Commonwealth and invited people from the Indian subcontinent and from the Caribbean to come to Britain and, work in all sorts of different parts of industry. And so they did. They came and they built the NHS and, London Underground and the bus system and all sorts of things that we now take for granted sort of were built and work because of the hard work of the people who came to a very hostile environment and, succeeded in spite of hostility and racism and a color bar that I think people, particularly in North America, don't realize that people, like Black people were barred from getting jobs. There wasn't segregation in the same way as there was in the USA, but there were color bars put in place where people just couldn't get work if they were Black, and they couldn't rent homes if they were Black. Literally like posters outside saying no Blacks. So it's a personal sort of entry into a point of history that was important for Britain and for myself and why I'm here, basically. And it hasn't been represented. Like, Caribbean culture isn't really represented in games, and British Caribbean culture particularly isn't represented. And I wanted to do something. It was the 70th anniversary of the Windrush generation, and I wanted to celebrate it some way, so like creatively. And so that's when the game started.
Thank you for sharing. And Florent, how did you come across and decide to make this game taking place in various points in time, the present and the past, relating to the Franklin expedition?
Yeah, so actually the two authors of the original story that served as a basis for Inua were absolutely fascinated by the Franklin expedition and the story of the Franklin expedition. So for the people who do not know it, it's an expedition of two boats, the Erebus and the Terror, that left Great Britain in the 1850s in search for the Northwestern Passage. So they wanted to find a way to sail above Canada and to reach the Pacific Ocean in a shorter route. And they were pretty sure they were going to succeed because they were British and the British were the best sailors. And they got trapped in ice for 3 years, and then they disappeared. And only in 2014 did we actually find the first shipwreck, and 2 years later, the second shipwreck. And up until today, we don't really know what happened. So the authors were really fascinated by that part of the story, the mysteriousness of it. And very quickly, they came up with the idea to communicate in a universe where time would not really have any meaning. So because there's a setting that's a little mysterious, I don't want to spoil it. The fact that one part of the story takes place in the 19th century and the second part takes place in 1953 and the third part takes place nowadays doesn't really matter because those moments communicate through time actually in the game. And which is what is really interesting is that when we worked on Nathalie and Frédéric's story to adapt it into a game, of course there were Inuit people involved in the story because the Franklin expedition members met with Inuit people. And we discussed with them a lot and we consulted with them a lot to have the story as right as possible representation-wise. And we learned at that moment that for Inuit people, actually, the Franklin expedition was too big of a deal. Like everybody in Europe kind of considered the beginning of the existence of that part of the world with the Franklin expedition, because the white men didn't go there before. But of course, the Inuit people were living there for centuries, for millennia before that. So we acknowledged that and we evolved our inspiration from European history to actual history from that part of the world we were setting our story in. And that was really great to see that history is relative, is completely relative, depending on who sells it. That's why I was mentioning the thing about the winner writes history. We should never forget that there's no such thing as objective history. So, yeah.
Yeah, and Florent is touching on the next point about the importance and how do you go about researching the historical authenticity, the historicity of a period. Obviously, we are trying to adapt some sort of story to the modern day, so it becomes relevant, so it's useful for gameplay. Let's talk a bit about that, about the research that goes into it. How did you go about researching that historical authenticity? Shella, would you like to start?
Yeah, I suppose I come from a place that I have an advantage over everybody else when it comes to the research, because obviously my family is from the Caribbean, or one half of my family is from the Caribbean, and actually lived this history. And there are still, it's recent history, right? So there are still people alive who made that journey, and I am building a team of British Caribbean heritage people. So, Corey Bredesen is the first person that I asked to join the project, who's a writer in games that I knew, and I was like, you Caribbean heritage? And he was like, yep. And so I was like, yeah, I'm thinking of this game. So he joined, and fortunately for us, his grandfather actually wrote a little pamphlet about his time coming to Britain. And so it's like this, this like really important family record, sort of historical record, sort of for the whole nation, basically. It's really valuable, sort of first-hand account of what it was like, sort of him trying to get work, and some of the troubles that he had with people that he'd work really hard and get promoted, and then he'd get demoted because white people didn't want to have a superior who was black, and things like this, and just reading it as a first-hand account, and the sort of the lack of anger that's in the writing, this kind of this real this sort of grace that they took this like awful situation. So that was a really great source of research. And then we have things like the Black Cultural Archives in Brixton, which is a really important source of Black British history, and has all kinds of records and documents. And of course, when we started making the game, it was the 70th anniversary. So there were loads of exhibitions and talks, and things were just happening, and, sort of films being released and things like that. So, we were fortunate that we could go to museums and see stuff that normally would be ignored by museums completely. It kind of, unfortunately, the hostile immigration policy of the Tory government also raised the profile of Windrush, in that we discovered that for the last 10 years, the British government has been deporting people who were British citizens and invited to come here, and have been here sometimes since they were children, and have never been back to the Caribbean islands, and they've been deporting them. So that became a huge scandal, and that was in the anniversary year, which raised the profile, which then, linked even more sort of historical documentation and things was available to us. It was more headline news than it would have been, I think, otherwise. I think. Have I answered your question? I rambled a lot.
That's a lot of different sources.
Yeah, if I may just, I think that's very interesting, this project, because indeed I read the news, and you learn about the Windrush scandal and everything, but it's very difficult to get an understanding of what really happened, and of the whole this whole generation sort of it's been belonged by the society, and this is where games are interesting, because it's sort of this is why it's interesting compared to novels and cinema, because it's a different angles, and necessarily the people will play from a different angle, and that's very valuable, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Games are in a special position.
Florent, I wanted to mention with the Franklin expedition, like a part of the story in the game, and it's just what actually happened was the Inuit people, through the tales that they tell through the generations, they basically knew where these lost ships were, these shipwrecks that the Westerners, the white people, weren't able to find for over a century, but they just never listened to the Inuit people who knew where they were the whole time.
This is incredible. Like the fatuity and the self-centeredness of European people at the time and also today is really, really hard to believe. For instance, when they were looking for the shipwrecks, so it was like a few years ago, actual Inuit from today said, gave them tips about seeing a mast emerging from the ice and things that they actually saw because they've been hunting in those territories. And it was like almost 2 kilometers south of the location where the rescue mission, the archaeological mission, was looking for. And they had the biggest possible trouble being believed and their information considered important and relevant because just like, what can an Inuit hunter who does not know anything about archaeology really know about our big mission of finding the wreck? And actually, they were right, and that's thanks to a tip by
Imagine. They were right.
Imagine that. Imagine. Incredible. And it was already the case. Like, it's been the case for as long as the relationship of the West with the Inuit people goes, basically. It was probably like, we don't really know much about what happened when the survivors from the Franklin expedition met with the Inuit. But we know that they met, we are almost certain that they met. And we know that they weren't able to make it, which probably means that they didn't trust the Inuit enough to actually put their lives into their hands. And if they had done so, maybe they would have come back from their ice trap to get back to England. We'll never know, but we can only assume that should have been they more trustful and more interested in what the Inuit could teach them, they would probably be still alive. And that's actually what was really interesting to me. Like, obviously, I'm not an Inuit, so I thought that if we were to make this game, we would absolutely have to challenge that position of the European who knows and who does better. And so that's why it was really important for us to actually meet Inuit people and listen to them, especially because among Inuit people, oral tradition is really important. Stories are told, they are not written down, they are not transmitted in the way that European people transmit their stories. So it was really important for us to meet and to listen. And I'm really glad we did that. For instance, the mere fact that the Franklin expedition in itself was almost an insult to a lot of Inuit people. I didn't know that. And I wouldn't have known that if I didn't, like if an elder lady didn't explain it to me why. And she explained it to me because first she refused to work on the game because she was like, I don't really want to work on yet another project on the Franklin expedition. And so I asked her to explain why she wouldn't. And that's when she explained that he was taking all the space. The Franklin expedition was taking all the space compared to other stories that she personally felt were way more important. And that's ultimately what Inua is about. Inua is about people who meet with the unknown and are unable to listen. And that's causes their demise.
I really love that. I could definitely get that even from the early parts of the game. And Daisy, that makes me think about how you can not just take what actually happened in history and put that in a game and try to experience that through a game, but also think about the themes of the era, the themes of the cultures. Are there any narrative themes in Card Shark that align with the cultural ideas of that era?
You know, up top, Francois was describing about how 18th century France was a time of great instability, and with that came a lot of social mobility. And it just meant that the gameplay of playing this young man ascending up the ranks of high society fitted really neatly into this backdrop. And it was also like an incredibly prosperous time for crooks and cheats. And this idea of morality was quite elastic, and it, in terms of writing, it just presented us with lots of opportunities to play with the idea of cheating. And it's not just straightforward cheating or exploitation. It's you often think that you are in control of the situation, and then learn later on that you are the one being exploited. And it was just a very fun time period to work with.
One of the ideas that I learned about when talking to Nikolai was the idea of, in the Enlightenment era in France, we're starting to question the existence of the supernatural and the powers of fate, and how that plays into the ideas of probability and being able to, if you shuffle a deck of cards and whoever wins isn't just fate, but it can be controlled. And that kind of theme is something that really resonates with me when I play Card Shark.
Yeah, I mean, we had some quite serendipitous moments as well during, like when you're researching something and then you realize it aligned really nicely with the design. So, for example, the character is mute, the main character is mute, and I decided to do some research to see how muteness was perceived in 18th century France. And granted, this bit of research was 100 years later, but poetic license. There was a lot of talk about how muteness was seen as a sort of supernatural thing, and how it was often tied up with seizures, but there was mystic properties. People in 18th century or 19th century France believed there were mystic properties associated with seizures. And it just so happened that we were looking for a way to reset a scene that made sense with the narrative. And we came up with this idea that perhaps if you were to die in a scene and you needed to reset it, it would just be one of your seizures. And the main character is kind of buttered up by his mentor, who tells him about all of the mythology around muteness and seizures and stuff like that. And yeah, there's just something quite nice when you feel like you're stumbling across incidental details that support the design.
So Shella, how do you think, I know it's still pre-production, so a little early, but how do you think you'll decide which historical elements to keep or to modify when you're adapting something in history for a modern day audience?
I don't know yet, really. It's the short answer. I mean, it's easier for us because it's recent history, so there's not it's not kind of extraordinary. It's not as exotic as, something further back in time. So, they're wearing the same clothes pretty much, and, there's TV and stuff like that. So, it's a recognizable world, and, they speak largely the same. So I think things I've been thinking about are vernacular, the Caribbean vernacular, and how much of that to use, and so maybe the way people speak, like how much to use that is quite interesting sort of challenge for writers quite often when there's some how much patois we might use, or Creole from different Caribbean islands and things like that, and how to not become sort of pastiche or fall into stereotypes and things like that. And then I suppose in terms of the history is also how visceral do we want, because it's it's a difficult time as a Black immigrant in 1950s or early 60s. Britain is, it's difficult. You're meeting challenges every step of the way, but we don't want this to be an utterly bleak story. That's not the tone we really want to set, but also we don't want to shy away from what the reality of the experience was. So it's So I think for us, the real challenge is striking the balance with, representing the culture and without becoming stereotypical, and also not, this, having this sort of oppression porn kind of feel to it. We don't want to exploit these people's stories. So that's the challenge for us. And how we decide what to keep or not is going to be a question of iteration, I think, and just like having a vision and staying true to what we think the tone should be, and sort of how to manage that, how to balance that. Going to be tricky.
Francois, in Card Shark, there are quite a few historical accuracy liberties that are taken. One of them is the characters in the game, while they are almost all historical figures, they're definitely not from the same historical time period. But so how did you decide which ones to keep and which ones to modify?
So basically, we tried first. It's a very documented era. But in the same way, as Florent said, it's the history of the winners. So for France, it's the building of the Republic, basically, and the nation afterwards, the 19th century, with all the bad implication it has. And basically, what we try to do is to avoid that. So it's to pick characters that are relevant inside history, but don't tell the same history as the history of the revolution, like we know. So that means we did that also with an aim to make it relevant for the gameplay. So basically, the process was we would pick story figures and look at the history. So just like maybe there. And also, this is great from a writer point of view, because the stories you come upon, like, they're crazy, like literally. Like we got this character Theodore of Corsica, who was a German soldier who came into Corsica one day and decided to become the king of Corsica because he was a bandit, really, and he just became the king of Corsica. And this is crazy. And you had like Julie d'Aubigny also, with a crazy figure who she stormed a nunnery to save a lover who was a nun, okay, and she put fire to the nunnery at the same time. And she was a swashbuckling, so she was fencing, like she was doing fencing. She was an opera singer at the same time. This is like crazy life, like you don't imagine. And also, if you remove a bit the filter of the winners, of the nation builder, you have very interesting figures, like Saint Georges, like I don't know, that's like Saint Germain. The character the main character in the game, Saint Germain, is a mythical figure. It's like he's supposed to have lived for hundreds of years, because many people sort of took the mantles of become the Count of Saint Germain, and it becomes this sort of mythical creature that never dies, because multiple people say they are the Count of Saint Germain over the years, and this is very, very interesting. So we basically picked every character like this, just to tell a different story, which is a bit fantasy, but in a Dumas way. Like you want to make nice things with history, and you want, and that's my personal aim, is to make that people get interested in things. Like you get interested in Voltaire maybe at some point, or you get interested in Julie d'Aubigny, and then you look a little bit, like, and this is interesting because we're making games, so we probably are not necessarily for game like Card Shark, but we probably talk to people who don't necessarily read the history books or watch that type of movie. So maybe this creates an interest in something different, and maybe hopefully one day they will look at Voltaire, and that's also very interesting. So this is it. And after that, basically, we picked characters that are meaningful, and then we would adapt the scene. So a bit like a boss in a boss fight. You see, our historical figure, they define what's around them, the lair, if you want, and the technique that you will use to beat them, like the technique you use to beat a boss, if you want. And it needs to be consistent, and that's how basically we got inspired for the gameplay itself. Like each character, you need to apply a different strategy because of that character.
If I could just tag on to the end of Francois's answer, I thought what Shella was saying was really resonated with me, because I was more involved in the tutorials throughout the game, where the players taught how to play these techniques and strategies in the next scene. And I was really self-conscious that I might end up using some sort of like approximation of a fantasy video game 18th century speech, which I don't really feel I have enough of a knowledge of to pull off properly. So what we sort of ended up doing was using I always think of a writer like Hilary Mantel, who managed to approximate Tudor English in her books without really committing to a particular style of dialogue, but there's a consistency and a clarity to it, which is essential for a game tutorial. So I found that very inspiring. And then once we'd done a full pass of all of the tutorials, we could then start playing a bit with the language or the structure of the tutorial, and having the characters' personalities come out a bit more, bookending it with sort of context of 18th century France. But there was a constant act of trying to balance these two different modes of writing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, lots of interesting things. I hope the viewers are thinking about how they can adapt or how they can put a historical setting into their narrative that they want to tell through their game. And as we wrap up, what advice would you give to someone who wants to set a game in a historical setting? Florent?
I would say something that comes from my journalism background. I've been a journalist for 10 years, and it was already true when I was working on journalistic pieces. And it's even truer in this context of a game, is that you absolutely have to have as many sources of information as possible. A variety. You can go to books, you can go to documentary films, you can go to libraries, you can go to museums, you can of course go to the people who are actually either living the situation you want to describe, or the descendants of the people who lived the situation you described. If you're not, as Shella is, one yourself, of course. It's really important to, as much as possible, gather information. And that is for two reasons, I think. The first one is that obviously it will nourish you, and you will grow more and more familiar with the setting that you want to talk about, and you will understand why you want to talk about it, because maybe your initial motivation wasn't the best possible one. Maybe you need to reconsider your position, and the only way to be able to do that is through documentation again and again and again, to be certain what the theme of your game is and how you can harness historical knowledge to serve the theme of your game. And two, because it will actually, and that's what Francois said, I'm completely in agreement with that, is that you can actually, like, reality and history, even though as I already mentioned, history is a very relative concept and there's no such thing as the real history. Then again, history, as we've been telling each other for centuries, is an incredible source of stories, amazing one, very, very normal ones, very mundane ones, and it's just food for your mind. And as a game designer, it's also food for your game design, because you will react to what you will learn in ways that are playful, probably, and that will probably give you hints and ideas game design wise, like any historical trivia can just like turn under your shower into a very cool game idea. And I think it's really, really, really sad that real life stories in general and historical stories in particular are not seen as the huge source of inspiration that they are. I'm not saying that history is absent from video games, because it's not true. There is history in video games, but there could be a lot more, and I hope there will be in the future.
Mm-hmm. Shella, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, that was a very comprehensive answer, Florent. No, it's good. You covered all the good bases. I think something I found out from Making Before I Forget, because even though, I mean, it's set in the past, but it's not a historical game, but we were making a game about dementia, and neither of us had any experience of dementia. So it was, we came from a similar position, basically. At the start, the first thing we did for our game was lots of research and read books and look at documentaries. But one of the things that we learned was that academics are a really great source, and it may feel intimidating to approach academics, but I think they are really open to being approached by people, especially something like video games, because I think they might. If you said, I'm making a game set in, Enlightenment era France, I want to know about, I don't know what it might be, the sort of like domestic structure of something, they might be like, really? Video games? Okay. It catches them off guard, is what I found. That, we worked with two medical professionals for Before I Forget, and one of them didn't play video games at all, but, took time out really generously to play builds of the game and like give us feedback. And it was invaluable. I did a whole pass on the writing just based on a really small bit of feedback about a particular symptom of dementia and things like that. So yeah, definitely try reaching out to academic institutions. And there are also organizations like OCA that tries to help you partner with academics and people who are researching things. So like, for instance, for Windrush Tales, we're hoping to make connections with people who do research into mental health and the impact of racism and immigration and mental health, and the connections between those things, which of course are deeply relevant for Windrush Tales, which is, about generational trauma, going back, like 300-400 years, because of why the Caribbean exists, why there are Black people there in the first place. So, yeah, that would be my top tip. Academics are cool, and they like talking about their stuff.
Having this, I've heard games be described as empathy machines before, and I do really believe that it does situate the player very firmly in this world, which is otherwise inaccessible. And if you manage to tap into the emotional heart of it, you create this engagement like nothing else. And if you don't manage to tap into the emotional heart of it, it can come across a bit educational, which is never really something which you want to hear a game being, that being its first descriptive. But if you manage to pull off the emotional side of it, then you can pull off the educational side of it as well. And that's like a really amazing tool.
Okay, well, thank you all for participating in this panel. It's been a really lovely discussion talking about games in historical settings. And how can people continue to follow you and to follow the games that you're making and have made?
I am at Shella Ramanan on Twitter, and we have at Windrush Tales is on Twitter as well. That's probably the best place to follow me, but if you're leaving Twitter after recent news, I'm at Shella Writes on Instagram as well.
Yes, the recent development of news.
The most historical recent history.
Sure, definitely. We actually have two games that are part of this LudoNarraCon. So Inua, which is already out, is in the sales, and the Rec, which is not yet out, is in the selection. And both are news from both are available on our Twitter at The Pixel Hunt. And I'm not on Instagram, but I'm on TikTok. We are on TikTok, even though I don't understand anything about TikTok. I would probably not recommend you follow our TikTok account, contrary to Nerial's TikTok account, which is very good.
Yeah.
And on behalf of Nerial and Card Shark, you can follow us on Twitter at Nerial, that's Nerial, and on TikTok and Instagram at Nerial Games. Card Shark will be out soon, so please wishlist it on Steam and on Switch. You can wishlist Windrush Tales on Steam. You can buy Inua, like Florent said. You can wishlist the Rec as well. The Rec looks really, really awesome. I can't wait to try the demo along with LudoNarraCon. And once again, it's been really lovely. And thank you so much for being a part of this panel. Thank you to everyone watching. And thank you to LudoNarraCon. It's been great.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.